Welcome to the Talent Equation Podcast. If you are passionate about helping young people to unleash their potential and want to find ways to do that better, then you've come to the right place. The Talent Equation Podcast seeks to answer the important questions facing parents, coaches, and talent developers as they try to help young people become the best they can be. This is a series of unscripted, unpolished conversations between people at the razor's edge of the talent community who are prepared to share their knowledge, experiences, and challenges in an effort to help others get better faster. Listen, reflect, and don't forget to join the discussion at thetalentequation.co.uk. Enjoy the show.
Well, I'm delighted to be joined on the podcast by James Vaughan, another coach working over at what seems to be a hotbed of talent development, youth development, constraints-led coaching over in AIK in Sweden, a colleague of Mark O'Sullivan's, recently been on a podcast again. James, welcome.
Thanks, Stu. It's a pleasure to talk to you today. Big fan of the podcast.
Well, I'm honoured that you say that, because I've been a follower of your work, particularly on the player development project, something we can probably talk about in more detail a bit later on. But as a starting point, I wonder if you could kind of give us the kind of potted history of your background and how you've ended up doing what you do nowadays.
Yeah, sure. I'll try and be as brief as I can, but it can be a long story. So I suppose I grew up in Nottingham. I'm with a dad who was a mad Liverpool fan. So at 6 years old, I ended up going to Notts County versus Liverpool. It was the first year of the Premier League. And it's one of my most vivid memories, kind of walking up the steps and seeing the green field and the perfect grass, and just kind of going, I would love to be there. How do I get onto that pitch? So I suppose, like many people, I grew up with dreams of playing football, and that led me to be or to start at Notts County's Centre for Excellence in those days. This was a time when Sam Allardyce was actually the first team coach. Wow. And that was an interesting environment to be in, and reflecting on those experiences later on in life certainly led me into the area of research that I'm in now, especially my master's in looking at player motivation, and now with my PhD in looking at creativity. But look, after a while, I kind of burnt out at Notts County, as many people did. And my family moved to New Zealand, which was a big culture shock. That was at 16 years old. So I'd gone from being a good football player and having a lot of status, if you like, with friends around being a good football player, to New Zealand where no one cares. So you kind of go from being like, if you want to like categorize it, you go from being the cool kid to being the kid that no one cares about at all.
Hero to zero.
Yeah, exactly. But that's really important, because that made me like very aware of cultural norms. You know, the UK and New Zealand is very similar, but in ways it's very different. So when I eventually ended up going to Otago University, I was more open to, shall we say, a critical reflection on, say, sport in general in New Zealand and the position of the All Blacks. I remember sitting in one lecture and looking around, and the lecturer was talking about the All Blacks and trying to critically reflect on their place in New Zealand society. And I'm looking around the room, and everyone's kind of eyes is glazed over. And I'm the only one sitting there going, yeah, I get this. So, I mean, that started me on the journey in terms of reflecting on culture, which has probably led me to where I am now. But I also got to thank a couple of people from Otago University, but Tanya Cassidy in particular, she gave me a paper called The Untouched Excellence of Brazilian Football Players. And I believe she got this from Cliff Mallett, who's my supervisor at the moment, or it might have been Chris Button. But basically, after reading that paper, I became very interested in futsal and started coaching futsal before I started playing futsal. So at university, I was trying to do everything, which included being the head coach for the university football team, and coaching futsal, doing my study and things like that. And it was a very interesting experience in terms of, if I just take the football coaching, I had a very interesting journey. I started as player coach, which meant I had to be really player centered, because I ended up coaching friends and people that were 2 or 3 years older than me. So creating a consensus and a shared ownership was something that just had to be done. Yeah. And then I went away over the summer on a coach education course, came back the next year, and I was like, right, guys, now I know how to coach. And from being player-centered, it flipped to completely coach-centered. And that experience, I had one season like that, if you like, a season and a half, actually may have been 2 seasons, because I went on to coach another senior team in Dunedin. But I realized very quickly that this didn't work. And I wanted to find out a little bit more about coaching. And I'd always intended to go on from my bachelor and try and do a master's. And I was really lucky to enroll at University of Queensland online. And through futsal, spend some time over there and meet Cliff Mallett. So Cliff encouraged me to do an MPhil, which we looked at self-determination theory and player motivation. And that was the start of a postgraduate experience, if you like. And that kind of ticked away in the background for a couple of years whilst I moved from being a futsal development officer in Otago to a football development officer in Auckland. And I did that for 2.5 years. So I kind of started coach education. I was working on the junior framework, the whole of football plan, which was led by John Herdman. And we had influences like Lynn Kidman, who was also my supervisor for my master's. So I've been very lucky to have some very good people, I suppose, guiding my learning for the last wee while. And at the same time as all of that was going on, I'd started playing futsal, and just socially. And what I found was that when I play football, even today, I still carry with me some of those expectations from when I was a youngster. So even when I was playing in New Zealand and I was away from the environment of the academy and the pressure that came with that, I still never felt completely free to express myself, if you like. I still felt kind of like held back by these expectations that I'd internalized. And when I played futsal, it was completely different, which was really interesting for me. So I actually developed quite well in that environment and got to the point whereby I was selected to play for New Zealand on a couple of occasions, which meant a World Cup in Colombia and different trips around the Pacific Islands and into Asia to play as well. And the interesting thing there was I went on this kind of quite steep learning curve and getting really good at a game between about the ages of 19 and 25. And then I got into the high performance environment again, and it became pressure, it became more controlling, just a more controlling environment again. And that learning curve seemed to plateau out. So I think from my own experience, it kind of gives me the anecdotal evidence, if you like, to pursue the kind of research that I'm looking at.
I think it's interesting, actually, and a lot of people who come on the podcast, and when I ask them, to tell their story, it's quite interesting how there seems to me, anyway, to be a bit of a common theme around experiences, and those experiences, both as participant and as coach, kind of leading to a path which kind of moves it moves you to a sort of the space that you're in now, which is exploring athlete-centered, player-centered approaches to coaching, and creating environments and learning environments and all those sorts of things. And it's very interesting, if I was to reflect on some of the guests I've had and everybody else, it's quite interesting how the stories do have some similar themes. I mean, you have to say, though, talk about inevitability. When you list some of the names like, Cliff and Chris and Lynn, who are on your kind of developmental journey, if you didn't end up in this space, something would have gone wrong, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it would have, and then very, very early on in player development project, we started talking to Mark Upton and Al Smith, and obviously came across Mark and Dennis, who I'm now with at iCore. So yeah, I've been very, very lucky in that regard.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, Mark and Al, I consider those guys friends of mine, and have been very fortunate as well to mix in in their circles. And they've been very influential as well on me. So it is interesting how our influences guide us. One of the things I was going to ask you about was what was in the untouched brilliance of Brazilian soccer players? What was it that kind of ignited the spark?
Well, it was futsal, essentially.
Okay. Right.
Yeah. So it was looking at smaller formats of the game, and it was funny because it was a one page. I think it was a conference paper. So I'm not sure. I never actually got the fully written up paper, but at that stage of my development, whatever you want to call it, that was enough for me. I think I'm a little bit more critical these days when it comes to looking at academic research. Hopefully I've learned to take in a few more papers before I kind of run after something. But at that stage, it recommended futsal as a good modified game.
And there may be some people listening to this who might not be that familiar with futsal. From your perspective, how would you, I mean, not necessarily the game as it is now, the formal game, but the origins of futsal? It might just be worth giving people a little bit of a picture of that. Yeah,
well, that's right. I think, and that's probably something I'm not doing justice to in talking about just futsal. I'm sure the paper also referenced the Brazilian culture. And just the prevalence of small-sided games in unstructured environments. So that for me is street football, if you like, which I suppose has been formally or formalized into something like futsal. I mean, I'm fascinated with the Brazilian culture. There's been some really interesting research on that and the sociocultural constraints over the last couple of years, which again really inspired me to go and kind of do the PhD that I've ended up doing.
I mean, so for me, I think one of the things that I really like, a bit like you, really. I mean, I'm working in a different context, but I was quite taken by the futsal story. Football in the room, football to Salau. And the idea of it always often being in quite constrained space with quite variable surfaces and a ball that very rarely was fully inflated and therefore could afford, oh God, I've used the A word, but there we go, could afford different skills. Plus, if you combine that with a cultural context around, extreme poverty and football excellence being a route towards, a route out of that context, combined with a very kind of, flamboyant entertainment culture.
Yep.
That kind of, I mean, I'm generalizing enormously, but, the carnival idea. So the idea that football permeates that in the sense of, almost ability to exhibit brilliance and excellence in an entertainment context being as important as outcome, and then how that drives motivation to become a master or to develop mastery is quite an interesting dynamic, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is. It's fascinating. It's very hard to, I mean, studying culture, it's hard to not make generalizations. And I think when we talk about cultural patterns, like a macro level, that's what we are talking about. So there'll always be individual differences. But I think if we were to look at the sociocultural constraints, if you like, of, as you mentioned, poverty, of samba, of capoeira, they have melandridem, which I'm probably slaughtering the pronunciation, but it's a value in quick thinking, trickery, cunning. So you have a kind of a problem-solving element there, and a recognition that people need to bend the rules a lot of the time. And the history of that is, it's pretty fascinating. So all of that stuff, you get this kind of melting pot, or you get like, if you want to call it, like a constellation of constraints, which can lead to this kind of the style of playing football, which, using the A word again, might lead to a rich landscape of affordances. So more opportunities for action in the game, and players becoming attuned to having more opportunities for action.
The reason, by the way, for listeners, the reason why we're using the phrase the A word is because this morning James was talking about affordances in a blog post that I tweeted, and some people objected to the use of the word affordances. And I'm still debating whether we should just stick to the word until eventually people begin to understand what it means, or find a different phrase. I can't think of a different phrase, so I'm just going to carry on talking about affordances. Yeah,
I agree. Even here, there's been some talk about finding a Swedish word for it. And Dennis is like, no, there's no Swedish word for it. We're going with affordances.
I love that. Yeah. Just quickly, that term you used that described quick thinking and cunning and problem solving, what was it again? How do I spell it?
Malandrogen.
Okay, how do I spell that?
Oh, that's a good question. I'll tell you what, I can send you Luis, a really good PhD thesis by Luis Urara. And again, apologies for not being able to pronounce his name properly. He was supervised by Keith Davies as well. So right. I have a copy of that. I'm fortunate to have a copy, so I can send that through to you.
That'd be great. Okay. And is it freely available? Because if so, I'll post it on the website and people will be able to get it in the members area.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it is freely available.
Great. Okay. So the other thing I wanted to ask you about, something you said at the start as well, was, yes, you were a player coach and quite player-centered because you were very responsive to people's needs. And I've definitely done the same as well in my transition from playing to coaching. Mm-hmm. A lot of us do this, or I probably not you, but I certainly did, this thing of what I still think I could play. And I think actually the dynamics of being a player coach, I think quite interesting. And people often lose sight of that, actually. However, you then went on a coach education course and became coach-led. Now, that's really interesting. Tell me more.
Well, I mean, that says it all, basically. I started, it was an interesting time with the football club, so Otago University Football Club, OUAFC, as they're known. And we had a transition of leadership in the club, and we'd had a coach, and we'd been paying coaches lots of money, and we had no money. So I stuck my hand up and said, look, next year, I'd be happy to coach. I was doing a physical education degree. I felt like I knew enough to be able to do as well as previous coaches. I had to then, I suppose, have a work with the players that we had, make sure there was a consensus, do the things that today are recognized as being player-centered and meeting people's needs. I just felt I had to do that because of my position. And I suppose player-centered coaching is all about, if you want to use the term, empowering people. And maybe it's about having more of a kind of a network rather than a hierarchy. And that's what I ended up doing through instinct and because I had to. And then I went away on a coaching course and I came back the next year and I was like, right, now I know how to coach. Now you guys are going to listen to me. And also, I mean, it probably wasn't quite as bad as I'm making out, but the way that we were educated to coach back then, that was very much coach centered. So this was New Zealand football was in a bit of a transition at this time. This was before John Herdman had fully got his hands onto the coach education pathway and things like that.
And so, in terms of then because you also said that you then took that back to the team and it didn't work. So, what were the indicators to you that it didn't work, apart from performance, perhaps? But go on.
Just general player motivation. Like I was being ridiculously controlling in the way I was working with them, demanding too much. These guys are students. The reason everyone's there to have a good time. Like if you look at self-determination theory, which at the time I had very little understanding of, and everything was built on relatedness, and also the sense of autonomy, I suppose, to an extent, but really it was all about social cohesion with the group, and a lot of that was based around going out and drinking and socializing with each other. And my approach at that time as a coach was to come in and try and make everything as professional as possible. So classic curfews and things like that. It really led me to kind of reflect on, players' motivation and my role as the coach in terms of my behaviors and how that influenced their feelings of what I later understood would be autonomy, competence, and relatedness.
So fast forward then through to today and the role that you've currently got and the work that you're doing and the research you're doing. I mean, you were very kind to send across to me a paper that you're working on, I think for your PhD, if I'm correct.
Yep.
I've read some of it, but not been able to read all of it.
You've done well.
No, I mean, there's a number of it was one of those, actually, in fairness, that I probably would have got further through it, but it was one of those that I was kind of going back to because there was sections that I don't think I was 100% grasping, but also there was definitely sections that I thought I really need to spend a bit of time thinking about. There's a particular quote in it that I'm going to try and play back to you in a minute that I thought is almost like the perfect summary of the entire kind of ecological approach to coaching, but I'll play that back later on. But as a starting point, I wonder if you wouldn't mind kind of just articulating what you're studying and some of the early areas that you're exploring, and particularly how they relate into your coaching.
Yeah, well, I could probably pick up on where we're at in the old coaching journey, because when I started to do the PhD, I applied at the University of Queensland and was very clear with Cliff Mallet that I was looking to look at other cultures and how other cultures influenced creativity. And so in football, in the context of football, really the playing style. And in the paper, I try and justify the playing style as an emergent feature of the form of life. So that was a real interest. And again, that comes from being very, very interested in the Brazilian style of play that we've talked about. So that led me to do different case studies. In the first place I wanted to go to do a case study was Barcelona. So for lots of reasons, some of them academic, some of them personal, but historically a venue where we see creative play on the pitch. So the idea was to go there and do a case study to try and understand the culture in more depth, and eventually have access to the club and see how what happens outside the club influences or kind of permeates into what happens inside the club as well. So I've been using the athlete talent development environment model, which is the circular model that people might be familiar with if they've seen some of the articles and blogs on PDP. But it kind of positions the player at the center of this wider context, and then understanding the context or the environment or the culture in terms of the macro environment, the macro system influences, and then the micro system influences becomes the goal. So I did that in Barcelona, but I never got the opportunity to get into the club entirely. So I was able to interview key people there, but I couldn't get on the grass, as you want to as an ethnographer and kind of be in and amongst people. And when I was visiting Sweden one Christmas, Dennis Icor asked me to come and present at the club and let them know about my research. And basically from there, it was 2 months-ish until I landed in Sweden to pick up on a second case study. And now I've been working in the club as an assistant coach in the academy and research coordinator. We've been... I suppose it's been a bit of a roller coaster ride, and it's been really, really interesting seeing how we started, I suppose, a research and development group probably about a year ago, and we got some really interesting projects on the horizon now. We have FC Barcelona coming over to do some research with us on collective behaviours in football. Team dynamics, and we've also got My Fastest Mile coming over to initiate a project which is a little bit more about the social and cultural environment around the club. So I suppose that's a little bit of a whistle-stop tour.
So the loads there. I'm interested to know. You've done a bit of you've researched, for example, Brazilian culture, and you made reference to at the start there to you talked about justifying the playing feature of the form of life. So again, some people might not be familiar
Yeah.
with the term around form of life. So I wonder if
Yeah.
you could just unpackage that a bit.
Yeah. So a form of life can be described as regular behavioral patterns. So it can be like movements, ways of thinking, perceiving, that become environmental constraints on the normative or the everyday behaviors and customs of communities and cultures. So yeah, I think the form of life, to use the A word again, really attunes people to some affordances, opportunities for action, while limiting interactions with others. I mean, the classic example, the really simple one, is comparing, say, a Brazilian form of life and a British form of life, and the opportunities to dance in Brazil versus the opportunities to dance in the UK. And then, in Brazil, you have ginga, you have this swaying motion that comes from their dance culture, infuses things like capoeira and football, and more traditional football approaches and ones that I was exposed to in New Zealand and early on in the UK are far more around working hard, risk-averse football, if you like, putting the ball in the right areas, maybe knocking it over the back line. And the classic example comes from, I think it was, I can't remember who wrote the blog, unfortunately, but he talked about playing in Brazil, nutmegging the captain, getting a high five, and then doing the same thing in England, nutmegging the captain and getting punched in the face. So it's an example of different kind of cultural constraints, if you like. It's yeah, and again, these are generalizations. So, but when we talk at the level of culture, that's what we're talking about: patterns and characteristics.
I was going to ask you about that, about the comparison. So, just reflecting, I suppose, sometimes on some of the responses I get, particularly when I, start to challenge particular methodologies. As everybody knows, I've been pretty strong and staunch advocate of kind of moving away from a drills-based approach towards, a much more what I consider to be a player-centered and kind of games-based model that meets their needs from both a motivational perspective and from a learning perspective. The response to that often is quite, can often be quite vitriolic. And one of the things I've noticed is there is this sort of almost like it's this very interesting cultural dynamic around, and I've started to pick up the fact that it seems that there's, it's almost going against a cultural narrative, like you say, around the way people learn and the way our society is created. And I was sort of reflecting about kind of like Western societies. So if you particularly talk about, say, the UK and America, where, very, very strong kind of capitalist work ethic type cultures driven by, kind of very kind of industrial education systems or education systems designed around industrial needs versus other nations where you haven't had that level of industrialization maybe yet, and the culture as a result being far more, I don't want to say diverse, but in terms of far more I guess driven by human interaction, I guess, and the joy of life, as opposed to life as a means for the production of of the nation, and how that's then manifest into our sporting cultures. It's quite interesting just to reflect on that, I suppose.
Really interesting. I think a word I've tried to use to describe that is more open. So perhaps it's just more open and open. When we talk about systems, an open system is a system that it's open to interactions and exchanges, if you like. So I think that works well with the idea of more interactions for people. There's a good comparison that I have between Barcelona and Sweden, which might shed some light on this. Because I must say I haven't researched Brazil other than reading other people's papers, whereas I've been in Barcelona and I've been in Sweden. So it was described to me by someone, a Swede who'd lived in Barcelona for 10 years. This was their take on things. They said Barcelona's standard of living and life in general is lower and broader. So like everything feels like a Friday or Saturday night, but you know, things can be a little bit dirty. It can be a little bit loud and a little bit noisy. But it's broad and there's so much to do. There's so many different cultural activities and so many people doing a diverse range of things. And that fits really well with two key cultural values they have in Catalonia, the value of sen and rausch. So sen being a value in natural wisdom, in looking after the land, in being sensible, in being patient, recognizing that you have to wait for the harvest. You have to be patient and wait for things to grow. And then rausch being the complete opposite. It's like defying social norms, defying social consensus. It's emotional, irrational outbursts. And so what they recognize is that you have to have this range, this scope. You can't have sen, you can't be sensible all of the time. You have to have an outlet for it as well. So even within these cultural values, that mirrors this idea that the culture itself is broader. And what it maybe that means it can't be as productive as you say. So maybe it means the overall standard of living is a little bit less. I mean, friends in Barcelona joke to me that it's the Southeast Asia of Europe, you know, but the social interaction is amazing. The lifestyle is fantastic. But when we lived in the center of the city, it was hard. It was dirty. It was warm. The apartments aren't as nice as they are in Sweden. And, you know, this whole long list of things. Now, in comparison, this person said to me, the difference is with Stockholm is it's high and narrow. So there's a high standard of living. And I must admit, being here for a year now, there is a very high standard of living, but narrow in that there's not that diversity of cultural activities and options for interaction. And this actually mirrors one of the key cultural values here, which is lagom. So lagom is this value in, it's kind of translated to English as not too much, not too little, just the right amount. So it's finding the middle path between the extremes. So that for me again is would suggest that you have this narrower range of accepted activities, and certainly that comes through in my data here in terms of social expectations and things like that. So hopefully that shines a bit of a light on some of the differences and some of the ways we could conceptualize culture.
It's interesting. And how would you say those two things manifest themselves in their approach to people development, in terms of coaching and also, broader maybe around the idea of how they approach things like talent development, for example?
Well, okay, the really classic one here is, and you touched on it before, the industrial success that they've had, the engineering success that they've had here in Sweden means that linear thinking and linear planning is something that they absolutely excel at, but it's also something that is a big constraint.
Yeah,
and I think it's made it harder for newer forms of leadership and coaching to come into the country. So player-centered coaching here is not as well known as, say, New Zealand and Australia, in my opinion. And perhaps that has something to do with it. But in terms of the way football clubs are organized, and in terms of the amount of administration that goes on in clubs, the focus is more on these tangible planning activities rather than, say, the intangible how we coach. which would be around understanding self-determination theory and around concentrating more on the interactions between the coaches and the players, and recognizing that, hey, this is a learning environment we need to create, not an environment for organization. And I think there's a shift in that thinking at the moment. And in many ways, I-Corps leading that shift, which is nice to be involved in. And did that answer the question?
Yeah, it does. I mean, I'd be interested though in terms of then. So I can totally resonate with that. So if you then to flip that, say towards Barcelona, again, based on the experience and your ability to observe this, how would you articulate their approach in comparison?
Well, I'm actually going to borrow from a conversation that I've had a couple of times with Dennis, because I think this is more his take on things than it is, or at least he brought this to light initially. Because the cultural context is so different, what they do in the football club is going to lead to a different combination of constraints, if you like. So, as an example, let's say because everything is so free and unstructured in general life, and having more structure in the football club may be beneficial. So, whereas if you have a very structured and very organized kind of day-to-day life and school and meeting friends and cultural activities are quite limited, then the football club maybe needs to be less structured. Does that make a... Yeah, so that's Dennis's take on it. And I would say, to me, that makes a lot of sense. I can't comment too much on being inside Barcelona and seeing the training sessions too much. I've been, but probably only... I've watched a lot of matches, and I would have seen maybe 3 or 4 coaching sessions whilst I was there. So it's not really enough to comment on the coaching approach as such. But the wider culture is so different. So I think that shapes the dynamic between the football club and the culture, then shapes something that's quite different.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because I've noticed, particularly in, if you talk about kind of like, hotbeds of research and innovation in coaching practice, particularly in football, but also particularly in the, let's call it the kind of non-linear learning space. I would categorize kind of Spain and Portugal as being, their output is quite high, and their approach to coach education and development and the emphasis they place in terms of where coach learning, the standard, in terms of what the expectation is in terms of what a coach is expected to know about their craft, shall we say, is very, very, very high in Sweden. Sorry, not Sweden. I'm not saying it isn't in Sweden, but certainly in Spain and Portugal, I've noticed this. Whereas I've noticed, and certainly having spent a lot of time working in the UK coaching system, and I don't know about Sweden, so you could tell me a bit more about this. I know a little bit about Sweden, having gone over there and spoken, done some speaking and worked with Peter Mattsson, who's involved in the Sports Confederation over there, and then just talking to him about cultures and stuff. So certainly in the UK, though, our system is, I think, based on quite an industrial model. And it's also based on almost like a kind of mass production approach to learning and development. So it's almost like, right, we're going to give you pure and simple, the basic kind of technical competencies. It's almost like being able to produce widgets in a factory. It's literally almost like that. So there's no emphasis on, critical tactical evaluation, critical thinking, research, application of research, none of that. Apart from at the very, very high levels, it's very much just be able to do the fundamental basics of the job in as little time as possible, maximum efficiency versus maximum effectiveness, probably a bit extreme, to be honest, but you know what I mean? I'm just broadly talking about the approach, if you like.
Yeah.
And that seems to be quite, actually, that's not true. Actually, it is actually borne out by some research we've done recently. But anyway, and grounded in a very behaviorist approach to human development versus so I would describe the kind of what you described to me as the Barcelona one is far closer to a more of a constructivist model than whereas so Sweden probably I imagine by the sounds of things with not too much, not too little is sort of navigating somewhere between those two spaces. Is that about right?
Yeah, that would be about right. I mean, there's lots of ways to look at that, and it comes through in some of the data that I've collected, even when you consider where Sweden has sat and its role in the Second World War. Is potentially neutral. Its role during the Cold War, I mean, it has Russia on its doorstep the whole time, so it's situated between East and West.
Yeah.
Even, I mean, renowned on a political or global level as being kind of mediators and people that are happy to try and mediate a debate. Even recently, it was kind of proposed as a venue for Donald Trump and the leader of North Korea. And so you have this idea of being la gomme can even come through in its geography. But I have a quote here which I can share with you, which I think kind of hits the nail on the head. So this is talking about, people ask what are the influences of the Swedish style of play. This is not me talking, this is someone else. So they say, well, we come from a Newtonian paradigm, which in itself is very linear. Then we've built all our welfare through our industry, the only industry in Europe that wasn't collapsed after the Second World War. So we had a lot of positive encouragement from going to the factory lines, standing there, working hard and producing. And I think we relate success to planning and linear models in general. But maybe since football is dynamic and unpredictable, maybe we need to question that. Because of the nature of the game, not because we want to be someone else, but because of the nature of what football is. And for me, this gets at the crux of a real shift in football at the moment, and the idea of that people are adopting that football is a complex game, and very to generalize again, the countries that you mentioned, Portugal and Spain, seem to be at the forefront of recognizing football as a complex game, and having the pedagogy and the methodologies behind that to back that up. Whereas I think the cliche that my dad told me when I went and played football, keep it simple, stupid, is probably more reminiscent of a Northern European mentality. And Sweden's been massively influenced by the UK. In football especially, with people like Bob Houghton coming over and Roy Hodgson in the 1970s and doing very well at Malmö. He was the coach when Malmö played Notts Forest in the old Champions League final and things like that. So that influence is very interesting. And in talking to Al and Mark and John at My Fastest Mile about some of these things, one of their comments was how similar some of the historical trends are across Northern Europe, in terms of, and we're talking more generally there around the emergence of like a welfare state, which is something that was very big here in the 30s and 40s and 50s. And when you go to the museum today in the middle of the city, they have on display, they have an old apartment that was built in what they call the Folkhemmet era, which is the people's home era. And you walk around this old apartment in the museum, and they talk about how it was built, why it was built. It was designed by engineers. It was designed so that everyone could get as much space as possible, and everyone had equal space and things like this. So I think there's some really interesting and very useful ideas and values and narratives running through Swedish history and Swedish culture that would work really well in football in terms of sharing space, understanding space, maximizing space. But at the moment, the dominant thinking seems to be more about the linear planning and the linear game models and the linear way of playing. To give an example in football, what I see when I go to holiday programs and watch kids play is that everything is just forward. It's like playing with blinkers on, and coming from Barcelona to then watching under 10s play there and watching under 10s play here, and not just the academy players in Barcelona, not just the highest level, but really occurred to me like that the kids here are so focused on going forward, straight away. So very linear, not multi-directional, if you like. Whereas in Barcelona, there's more of an understanding that the game is multi-directional. It goes side to side. The ball can go backwards. So for me, it seems like the ball and the goal are the major attractors here. More so than the teammates and the opposition players and the space that's afforded, given the way the teammates and the opposition players are kind of shaped up on the pitch. But obviously that's kind of, in saying that, I'm going from macro to micro very, very quickly. But I think I hope the research will continue in this area around cultural values and sociocultural constraints, and we'll be able to paint this picture a lot more clearly as the research moves in this direction.
So my background in terms of my sort of, I suppose my educational background was I went into sports science like a lot of people did, and walked into the sport, wanted to do sports psychology, and walked into the sports psychology lecture, and they said, if you can't do statistics and maths, then you don't want to be in this subject. So I just walked straight back out again, because numbers really have never been my thing, as my bank account would attest to. So I then started to focus on more of the kind of social science side of sport. Particularly got interested in sociology, cultural studies, philosophy, ethics, these sorts of things, which probably come through loud and clear in this particular show. So I'm very interested in this whole thing. And one of the reasons I think it's really important to study it is that I think for a lot of people it will probably, hopefully, resonate with them that I've had a lot of conversations on this podcast. Mark actually last week, I think it was, talking about culturally resilient beliefs, and I had a really good conversation a couple of weeks ago with Steve Hooper from Inclusion Coaching, talking about how he feels like he's always sort of like fighting almost like a battle to justify this more kind of emergent creative approach to parents who are looking for structure and order. And I'm paying for this, so therefore I want to see them learning, and the only way I can associate learning is if I see structure. And it's kind of interesting, because I think a lot of people who are kind of working in this way and genuinely believe that a means by which for us to foster creativity is to do whatever we can to avoid giving people the answers, and how hard they're finding it to kind of break through these kind of cultural, like you say, norms. So I suppose it's like you're almost trying to have a kind of Catalonian approach and form of, or Brazilian approach and form of life in a cultural environment that says, but where's the structure, where's the order? We're very mistrustful of these creative types. It's kind of interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, it's very, very interesting. But I think also the really fascinating one for me here is that there is so much historically that lends itself. There are so many sociocultural historical constraints that we could amplify, because looking at it from the point of view that a constraint can be, it doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing. Yeah. As I mentioned before, like the recognition of space here, and design, like Scandinavian design, is something that's well recognized throughout the world.
Yeah.
And ultimately, we're talking about an efficient, functional design that makes use of space, so maximizes space. So again, like when you talk about football and you talk about the style of play in Barcelona and the positional game, if you like, which is really about maximizing space on the pitch, you have a cultural value that fits with that really nicely. You also have what happened around the time of Folkhammer was that there was this focus in designing or engineering, I suppose, these apartments that shared space and were equal for everyone. But then they integrated artists in the process. And what happened was that they started to then design this furniture that was going to be able to be used in these small apartments. And so you have these constraints led to some amazing creativity, which is the foundation of Scandinavian design. And really the bedrock of IKEA. That's the birthplace of IKEA, which is obviously recognized probably as the number one Swedish export around the world. So then if you follow that through and you go, well, what about design thinking as a way of working? And, you know, you have the great stories of the American, how is it? I forget the name of the places, but it's the type of thinking that goes on in places like Pixar, and this design thinking approach that, hey, we're just going to run with an idea, play with ideas and iterate. And there's no mistakes here. There's no wrong answers, but there's a collaborative process. And through this, we're going to co-create something. Now, that for me would be a wonderful way for coaches to work together, to design sessions and design a learning environment for players. So I feel like if that can be amplified and emphasized within the culture, then hey, this suddenly things start to shift in a very positive direction. Also, the emphasis on kind of social, social well-being of people. It's really interesting here. People are so, in my experience, they're more socially conscious, and that's really good. When I'm in an apartment, in my small apartments here in Sweden, you very rarely ever hear anyone making any noise. People are very conscious. If I kind of bump my knee in the evening and kind of make a noise, then Hannah is on me straight away. You can't be that loud. There's people. So it's brilliant in terms of people being conscientious, but it also can bleed over into something that actually constrains interactions as well. And an example of that is when Swedes go to leave the apartment in the morning, they have a look through their little door to check that the coast is clear and no one else is in the hallway before they step out. If someone's in the hallway, they'll go, oh, someone's there, we'll just wait for them to go.
Yeah.
Then they let them go and then they go out. So and this is the amazing thing about all this, is that what is really, really good can bleed over into something that's bad as well. And the picture I'm trying to paint here at the moment is that we have all these good things, these historical influences that could come through, could bubble through to the surface and emerge and lead to good behaviors and lead to really adaptive ways of working and creativity. But as Dennis calls it, we have like a neoliberal crust that sits on the top. And one of the key themes here that I've seen come through is this tension between competition and collaboration, and people being in a room together, working together in a group, and there being this tension of, are we competing with each other, or are we collaborating with each other? Because you have this rich history of collaboration, diversity and equality here, but then you have the reality of the modern world, which is based on competition. It's based on evaluation, ranking people into tables, giving people bonuses and money in terms of how they rank. And so this tension between the two is really, really interesting. And I think it's at the heart of a lot of footballs and maybe many team sports. Is at the heart of their issues, because football or association football is about people coming together. Like, it's association, it's people coming together socially to play a game. And it's those interactions between those people, which is so fundamental. And yet now the game is kind of surrounded by this individualism, this rampant individualism in a lot of ways, which is about who's the best player on the team. And at the younger ages, it can be really can be a real problem, as I'm sure a lot of coaches experience.
Yeah, I mean, and I can definitely reflect on this, because just in the way we conceive of skill, just in the way we, so a lot of people, and I've found this a lot, that they sort of conflate technique with skill. And so very often what we've moved towards, so in the UK particularly, we went through this phase of, we are not as technically competent as players from other nations. So we've doubled down. The assumption is, right, let's double down, right? We're going to do maximum amount of time on task of technique repetition. And if we do enough technique repetition, we will become more technically competent. Yeah. And what these organizations, I think, are now beginning to realize is, in an effort to become technically competent, and having spent a lot of time developing technique in isolation from any kind of context, what we've actually developed is very technically able individuals who aren't able to translate those technical capabilities into a cohesive scenario.
Yep.
And so that driver there has led to exactly what you're talking about now, where basically the assumption is, if I can amass enough super technically competent individuals, I'll be successful.
And that is mirrored in so many areas of life as well. It's not just sport, it's not just football. It's one of the arguments I try and make in the paper that I sent through to you around academia as well, and different disciplines, and the positivist, reductionist way of breaking things down. So you break down all those relationships between phenomena in a bid to understand them deeply. Whereas what we're trying to do now is understand the relationships between things and really put the focus on that. And that very simply is for me why the ecological approach and ecological psychology rings true, because it's the focus on not only the individual but also their environment and the interaction between the two. I think as a social and cultural constraint that probably sits across sport in general, you could look at the idea of trying to predict and control human behavior, which comes from a lot of the types of psychology that need you to do statistics, bits and pieces like that. Like that is something that I think is very obvious here, and yeah, it sounds like it's pretty obvious over in the UK as well. So I think, that's where recognizing the importance of the environment becomes really crucial. And I've actually got a couple of quotes that we could segue to.
Yeah.
If you're ready, then this is one I've wanted to share with you for a while, because my issue with talent is that the idea of talent that most people talk about is one of like something innate. And I think that again is something that if we can challenge, that's going to be really beneficial. So the quote here is that a skill, and more generally talent, is not a trait possessed by individuals alone, but a property of the athlete environment system subject to changing constraints.
That was the quote I was going to play back to you.
Yeah, I thought it might be.
Yeah, you go on as well in that particular section as well, though, isn't there? There's another bit to that, isn't there?
Yeah, with that exact quote.
Yeah.
There's another. I don't have the exact section up in front of me, but what I try and get at is, I mean, I include creativity into that, because this is for me. I think creativity can be seen as a property of the athlete environment system, which is subject to changing constraints. So therefore, it's viewed as emergent and momentary, and arising from that constellation of constraints within a form of life. So again, I don't want to be going around necessarily labeling people as being creative, but I think we can say this person has creative moments. And they seem to have quite a few of them when they're in this context, in this way. And to come back to what we've talked about, one of the things is this myth of the lone genius idea. So a lot of creative research, because I think a lot of the research suggests that creativity has been neglected as an area for research because it can't be predicted and controlled. So to simplify the whole thing, people have gone, oh, it's a lone genius type thing. People just have this innate genius.
Yeah.
And one of the things, I think it ties back to this overemphasis on competition and self-interest and individualism. So from being in these corporate capitalist environments, it kind of reinforces the myth of the lone genius, if you like.
Yeah, I definitely. I mean, if you just listen to or spend time reading, kind of like popular narratives around, around excellence or excellent performers, particularly in sport, you find it comes through really loud and clear about this idea that this individual would have made it come what may, whereas in reality, the detail of that story is often one of a combination of kind of, I suppose, inherited capabilities, family environment, opportunity, luck, and other influential individuals guiding a journey. I mean, I just take you back to your story. At the very start here, without your, I suppose, serendipitous stumble through the world and meeting of a number of different individuals, you may or may not have ended up in this scenario. But a lot of people would just assume, oh, well, you always would have ended up here. It just doesn't work that way, does it?
No, not at all. And I think that was actually one of the early ideas we had with the player development project, was to try and tell the real stories of player development. And shine a light on those non-linear journeys. And it's again, even like if you zoom out and I'm talking about the research done in creativity, recognizing that a lot of it comes from cultures that are very individualistic, again leads to this tendency that, hey, it must be an individual trait.
Yes.
Because that fits that narrative so nicely. And it's very interesting to go back. The Torrance tests of creative thinking are recognized as kind of like Paul Torrance is recognized by some as like father of creativity. And his tests are now used to identify gifted individuals. But that was not his intention, and that's not the intention of the test at all. The intention was to help people tap into and be more creative, and in actually putting down the procedure to do the test, if you like, he said people need to be in an environment that stimulates their creativity. They need to be in a motivational climate that is going to be conducive to creativity. And what he wanted to do was actually understand that environment and look to help people be in that environment and foster that environment. But because of the context surrounding him and the emphasis on individualism, these tests have ended up being used to identify gifted individuals rather than understanding the environment that people are in.
In exactly the same way things like the IQ test were done.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So
misappropriated for for nefarious particular nefarious reasons, and also then used to justify public policy, which reflected against, again, this industrial idea of how education should work, and those who are gifted being given additional support and those without should just be put into the industrial manufacturing base, and these sorts of ideas.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the interesting one is to consider the intentionality of the system, to use a little bit of academic jargon, if you like, but like what the system is directed towards, what is the goal of the system. And I think the reality of many of the systems that we work in these days is that this intentionality has emerged from all of these different constraints, from the history of an industrial past, from capitalism being the dominant economic system. So now we have a system with an intentionality that leads to the problems that we're talking about. So it's not like there's not like these malevolent or evil people that are necessarily driving this system.
Yeah, that's
the
right.
system itself is kind of like, is reinforcing it. And unless people are able to reflect deeply on the system and aim to understand it, then very, very well-intentioned people can end up reinforcing the problems that we're rubbing up against.
Absolutely. I mean, a big believer in this, and around the idea of that it's not necessarily that there are bad people. It's just that there are people in bad situations, or people in environments and situations that lead them to bad actions. Exactly.
And I think, we're really, hopefully we're turning a corner in placing the emphasis on the environment a lot more.
Mm-hmm.
A lot more.
I want to play back another quote. There's another one that I wanted to talk to you about as well, because I remember making note of this, which is it's a little bit of, I'm not quite paraphrasing, but you actually say, we propose that skillful manipulation, dampening or amplifying of socio-cultural constraints in the moment and over time by coaches, clubs, sporting organisations and governing bodies can better co-create the environmental conditions, customs, habits and ways of doing things in a form of life or human ecosystem that constrain and afford creative moments traditionally characterised by fluency, flexibility, novelty and appropriateness of the interaction. For me, that smacked me in the face in terms of going, wow, that's it right there. Almost didn't need to read anymore.
I probably should just put that in the abstract and then not worry about the rest of the paper.
Yeah, I mean, I had when I began a process of further study, I had a supervisor, Dr. Mike McNamee, who used to challenge me, and I now realize it's a challenge. At the time I found it really painful, but he used to challenge me to take an enormous work, something like, say, Kant's categorical imperative, and summarize it in 5 lines. You've done that there, more or less.
Okay, well, that means I can drastically cut down the rest of the paper, which needs to happen. So that's really good. Really good. No, but sorry, go on.
I was just going to ask you, actually, just unpack that a bit for us, because obviously, like you say, there's a bit of academic language there that may not have, people might not have been able to connect to.
Yeah. The idea of amplifying and dampening constraints, I suppose, would be if we, for example, recognize that having kids in an academy environment early on, that academy environment can lead to, essentially it's often based on elitism, because some people are included, some people are excluded. It can lead to a real focus on status within the group and anxiety. And then controlling behaviors around demonstrating who is the best player. So like we've talked about before, rather than the group coming together to interact and kind of be collaborate, they're really coming together to compete with each other. So if that's the general environment that kind of seems that being selected into an academy fosters, then and AIK, for example, they've raised the age of selection, and they've gone, okay, we don't want kids of a certain age being exposed to that for whatever reasons, because of those reasons rather. So that might be.
They want to dampen the influence of competition on the way that the kids interact. Yeah,
that's right, and competition. I have to be careful using the word competition, because I don't think competition within sport is a bad thing. That's obviously the basis of sport, but competition between teammates and it's more that kind of anxiety of who's the best in the group, the competing with people. The classic example is playing a rondos. And you say you've got 4 around the outside and 1 in the middle. And when you play a rondos and when you make a mistake, you go in the middle, and you stay in the middle until a mistake is made, then you're really shining a light on making mistakes, and you're shining a light on the defending being a punishment. So it's avoidance motivation. So what happens there, for example, is, let's say me and you are playing, and I notice that you haven't been in the middle for a while, and the others have been. It's me and you that haven't been in the middle. And when we're in like an environment where we're constantly jostling for position, I'm going to fire a ball at your knees so that you miscontrol it and you have to go in the middle. And then I'm quite happy knowing that I'm top dog in this environment. And that's something that I've seen through the research. And I think what we get to there is like, then I suppose at the level of coaches and constraints, you'd go, okay, we put the defender in the middle for 1 minute. And every time the defender touches the ball, they get a point. And everyone's going to have a go in the middle. And everyone's going to have an opportunity to do this. And then we're going to see which defender has the most points at the end of 5 minutes, once everyone's had a go. And so suddenly you're showing defending to be an opportunity for success. And so you're, rather than avoidance motivation, it's motivation to succeed. So then, and if you want to go even deeper, what you're doing there by constraining or like the defender in this way, or putting the emphasis on the defender, you're making it harder for the attackers because you have a more motivated defender in the middle. Yeah. So I think that's a really simple example of how we can play with these constraints once we understand the wider context and the wider environment. So at a structural level, you might have clubs making decisions about selection ages. You might have policies coming down from governing bodies. But then the coach as well can shape the session. And I mean, again, to use the word intentionality of the system, which is really the goal-directed behavior, if you like. When I look at that rondos and the first example, then the intention of those 5 players with the defender in the middle, the intention is not to be the defender in the middle, which places really low value on defending and makes defending your motivation is controlled when you are a defender, which we know leads to cognitively you're not as engaged, you're not kind of able to make decisions or be attuned to the environment in the same way when you're experiencing controlling motivation. Whereas when you flip the task round, the intentionality of that rondos or that system is then very different, because the defender then has this opportunity to excel, and the attackers have got to work together to keep the ball. I'm no longer kicking the ball at your knees so that you go in the middle. I'm giving you a really good pass to your back foot so you can open out if that's the right moment, so you can keep the ball, because we want to keep the ball. We don't want the defender to get points. So it's,
I mean, I love that. I think that's a brilliant, physical example, just using that example of kind of bringing back almost everything that we've talked about here, which is if you have to think about not just the cultural environment of the activity. And it's interesting because I think a lot of organizations are putting everything on practice design.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. Oh, it's all about practice design. Get practice design right, and everything else will take care of itself. Not saying that's not right, but it's only part of the picture.
Yeah.
You've got to think also about the wider sociocultural environment in the academy, in the talent system, or in the development system, or in the kind of cultural makeup of the sport, going right out to the sport and all those sorts of things. So you're talking about a kind of systemic change, because if you talk about, and I definitely came up against this, where I was working with young people in a talent context, weekly 2-hour sessions where we were creating a cultural environment based on creativity, expression, preparedness to fail, stretch, challenging our capabilities, cohesion. All these individuals were competing with each other for spots, even though we weren't selecting. But they were, and they knew where they were in the pecking order, and they were going back into either club or school environments where the cultural dimensions were completely different. The incentives were totally aligned in the opposite direction. It was about conformity, adherence to a plan, and the more we adhered to the plan, the more successful we were. And therefore, if you deviate from the plan and you try alternative ideas, then that's deemed to be a kind of negative and almost selfish ideal. And the dynamic tension between that and trying to create a motivational climate where people could unshackle themselves from this sort of dominant narrative that they were experiencing in club and school was a really, really difficult thing on 2 hours a week.
Yeah, it is. It's a massive challenge. I think, I think you've nailed it with that explanation.
Listen, James, I'm very conscious of your time, and I know you've got some important obligations to attend to in terms of supporting some loved ones with some of other stuff that they've got to attend to, and likewise, I've got some little ones likely to run through the door and create merry mayhem and chaos in this context. And I've also got to prepare, and you've given me some really good ideas, by the way, for a cricket coaching session this evening with 30 under 11 cricketers who are all playing with hard cricket balls for the first time, and so the potential opportunities for action of getting hit by a cricket ball in the side of the head are very high. So I need to probably prepare for that. But in the meantime, I just wanted to, a couple of things really. One is, first, thanks for coming on, and I'm really glad we were able to have this conversation. Second thing I wanted to just say was, how can people find you? How can they find out more? How can they reach out to you in case they've got thoughts, ideas, questions?
Well, the easiest way is through Player Development Project. So if people jump on there, they'll find a number of blogs that they've put together, and a lot of other excellent content on there as well from different contributors. And there's some, I suppose there are, discussions and videos and things like that as well. And I'm also on Twitter as well. And if you can chuck that in the show notes, that would be great. That's probably the best way.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I will do. No problem at all. In the meantime, I hope it goes well. I know you're coaching later on, or you're going along to a game, or whatever it might be, and so am I. And maybe in a few months' time, as your research progresses and you find out more, you'll be prepared to come on and share some of your learning, because I've certainly found the conversation massively stimulating.
Yeah, me too. I'd love to do that. It's been a real pleasure to play with these ideas.
Great stuff. Thanks a lot, James, and I'll speak to you again soon.
Cheers, Joe.
Thanks for listening to the Talent Equation podcast. If you like the show, then please consider supporting it by leaving a review on your favorite podcast player, telling your friends about it, or even becoming a hero and show your appreciation by becoming a patron. Just head over to thetalentequation.co.uk and click on the Becoming a Patron button at the top of the page.
And there you have it. Wow. Feel like I've disappeared into a vortex and got really deep into some of the thinking, some of the research, some really interesting discussions there with James about how culture affects the way we operate, the way we think, the way we're influenced in what we're doing. Really enjoyed that conversation, James. Thank you so much for coming on. It was felt a bit cathartic almost to be able to talk about some of the challenges that we're facing and some of the issues that people are coming up with. So I know that'll resonate with an awful lot of people, but certainly did with me. I love this idea of a neoliberal crust, which is this tension between competition and collaboration, and how that affects our sporting world and our coaching world. So big takeaway for me, that one, and once again, James, thank you for coming on. A couple of people to thank: Danny Shearing and Kevin Heath come on board. They've bought me a virtual cup of coffee to sit down and enjoy while they're listening to the podcast. Guys, your support is greatly appreciated. And Mark Matsopoulos, I'm probably butchering your name, Mark. I do apologise, but he's decided to jump in with both feet and join the conclave. Mark, you will be most welcome, and I'm looking forward to working with you over the next coming months. In the meantime, everybody, I hope your coaching goes well, and remember, ditch those drills.